Chapter 8 On the Bank Charter Act of 1844. 1. We shall now endeavour to explain as clearly as limits allow us 1 St. the causes which led to the enactment of the Bank Charter Act of 1844, 2. The objects intended to be effected by that act. 3. The mechanism devised for effecting those objects. When the Bank of England was founded, it lent all its capital to government, and was allowed to issue an exactly equal amount of notes. On several subsequent occasions its capital was increased, and at the same time it was allowed to issue an equal amount of notes. Thus for a considerable time its power of issuing notes was strictly limited to the amount of its capital, and it was provided that if the directors issued notes exceeding the amount of their capital they should be liable in their private capacity. Afterwards they were released from this limitation, and they were allowed to issue notes to any amount they pleased, provided always that they were payable in specie on demand. In 1797 the banks suspended payments in cash, from causes which we need not detail here. But during the war, being endowed with the power of issuing any quantity of notes they pleased, they gave countenance to very wild speculations, and at the same time an immense number of country banks started issuing torrents of notes. The natural result of this was a heavy depreciation of the paper currency. In February 1810, the market, or paper, price of gold had risen to £4,108, and the foreign exchanges had fallen to a similar extent. Guineas commonly passed for a £1 note and 68 or 78. This state of matters caused such a derangement of commerce that the Bullion Committee was appointed, who came to the resolution that this effect was caused by the excessive issues of notes. They said that the true value of the paper was to be estimated by the market or paper price of gold, and the state of the foreign exchanges. In former times a high price of bullion and an adverse state of the exchanges had compelled the directors to reduce their issues to counteract the drain of guineas, and to preserve their own safety. Since the restriction they had not followed the same principles, as they did not feel the inconvenience. Nevertheless they ought to observe the same rules as before the restriction, and to continue to regulate their issues by the market price of bullion, and the state of the foreign exchanges. Some proposals had been made of remedying the evil by a compulsory limitation of the bank's power of issuing notes. But the committee entirely discountenanced the plan of imposing a numerical limit on the bank's issues, because the necessary quantity could never be fixed, and such a course might very much aggravate the severity of a temporary pressure. A very important distinction however was to be observed between a demand for gold for domestic purposes, sometimes great and sudden, and caused by a temporary failure of confidence, and a drain arising from the unfavorable state of the foreign exchanges, that a judicious increase of accommodation was the proper remedy for the former phenomenon, but a diminution of its issues the correct course to adopt in the latter. The report emphatically declared that the numerical amount of notes in circulation at any time was no criterion whatever of their being excessive. The only sure criterion was to be found in the price of gold bullion and the state of the exchanges. 3. The House of Commons, however, rejected the report of the committee, and the bank being freed from all restraint, still further increased its issues, which became still more depreciated, until in August 1813, the price of gold bullion rose to £5,108, and the real value of the note was about 143. 2d. In 1814–15–16 an immense number of country banks failed, which reduced the paper currency to about one halt, and the effect of this was that in October 1816 the paper price of gold had fallen to £3.18. 6d. Thus the truth of the principles of the Bullion Report was clearly proved. The banknote was now so nearly brought to par, that in November 1816, the bank gave notice of their intention to pay off all notes dated before the 1st of January 1812, and in April 1817, all their notes dated before the 1st of January 1816. But in April 1817 a drain of gold began. The bank took no measures to stop it. The paper price of gold began to rise and the foreign exchange to fall. In January 1819, the paper price of gold was £4.3, and the exchange on Paris 23.50. The bank would have been very soon drained of all its gold, and an act was passed in April 1819 forbidding the bank to make any payments in gold whatever. 4. The bullion report had been contumeliously rejected by Parliament, but it had been vehemently discussed by the press, and in 1819 it had entirely converted the mercantile world. The evidence given in its favour in 1819 was just as strong, as it had been adverse in 1810, and among other persons, it converted Peel, the chairman of the Commons Committee in 1819, who said in his speech that there was no test of the excess or deficiency of the notes but a comparison with the price of gold. He also resisted the imposition of a limit on the issues the bank as a very unwise position, because there were occasions when what was called a run on the bank might be arrested in its injurious effects by an increase of its issues. It was, therefore, impossible to prescribe any specific limitation of issues to be brought into operation at any period how remote soever. An act was passed in 1819, commonly called Peel's Act, that the acts in force for restraining cash payments should be continued till the 1st of May 1823, when they were finally to cease. During the intervening period they might pay in bars or ingots of gold bullion of 60 ounces at certain prices. After the 1st of May 1823, they were to pay in gold coin as usual. This was Peel's Act which has been so much talked about, but it never came into operation at all. In 1821 the directors, having accumulated a large amount of treasure, procured an act by which they were allowed to resume cash payments on the 1st of May 1821. 5. In 1824 a rapid drain began from the bank, which took no measures to stop it. This went on all through 1824 and 1825, when the bullion which was above 13 millions in January 1824 was reduced to little over 1 million in December 1825. A great monetary crisis took place in this month, which was only arrested by the bank making very liberal issues of notes to support solvent houses. 6. In 1827 the bank was at last convinced of the truth of the principles of the bullion report and endeavoured to adopt them. The plan it devised was this: to keep their securities as nearly equal as possible, their cash and bullion at 1/2 of their securities, and consequently equal to 1/3 of their liabilities. But on several occasions the bullion had fallen to about 1/5 instead of 1/3. There were very severe monetary pressures in 1836 and 1837, but in the spring of 1838 the bank was again got into its normal position. But about the end of 1838 another period of disorganization commenced, as shown by the following figures. The bank was thus rapidly drifting into bankruptcy, and was only saved from stopping payment by negotiating foreign loans at Paris and Hamburg to the amount of £3,500,000. The being shown to be something radically defective in the management of the bank led to the appointment of a committee of the House of Commons in 1840, which condemned the principle upon which the directors professed to act. But nothing could be done, as the charter of the bank did not expire till 1844. 7. In the meantime an influential sect of currency writers had arisen, the most prominent of whom were Colonel Trans, Lord Overstone, Mr. Norman, and others. They maintained the following principles. 1. That bank notes, that is the promises of bankers to pay money on demand, alone are currency, and that no other forms of paper credit are currency. 2. That if banks are permitted to issue notes they ought to be only exactly equal in amount to what the specie would have been if there were no notes. 3. That any excess of notes above the specie they displace is a depreciation of the currency. Lord Overstone observed in his evidence before the Committee of the House of Commons in 1840 that it was a fundamental vice of the principle devised by the directors in 1832 to carry out the doctrines of the bullion report, that the gold might all leave the country without causing any diminution of the amount of notes in the hands of the public. We have seen that this assertion was completely verified in 1839. 8. The above-named writers, being of great influence, converted Sir Robert Peel to their views, and his Bank Act of 1844 was expressly devised for the purpose of carrying these principles into effect, and the machinery adopted was as follows. The bank was divided into two departments, the issue department, and the banking department. The directors were to transfer to the issue department securities to the value of £14 million, of which the debt due by the public to the bank was to be a part. and also so much of the gold coin and gold and silver bullion as should not be required for the banking department. The issue department was then to deliver over to the banking department an amount of notes exactly equal to the securities, coin, and bullion so deposited with them. The banking department was forbidden to issue notes to any person whatever, except in exchange for other notes, or such as they received from the issue department in terms of the Act. No banks or private bankers were allowed to commence issuing bank notes after the 6th of May 1844, and if any ceased to issue notes after that date, the bank might be authorized by the Crown in Council to increase the amount of securities in the issue department to 2/3 of the notes so withdrawn from circulation. Since 1844 several private bankers' hire ceased from business, and in terms of the Act the bank's power of issuing notes on securities has been increased to £15 million. Consequently its total power of issuing notes is now limited to £15 million plus the amount of bullion held by the issue department. It was supposed that these provisions ensured that the quantity of notes in circulation, that is in the hands of the public, would be exactly equal to what a metallic currency would have been, and that the outflow of bullion would by its own natural operation, have the mechanical effect of withdrawing notes from the public to an equal amount. Having made these provisions, the framers of the Act supposed that they had taken out of the hands of the bank all power of mismanaging the currency, and that they might manage the banking department at their own discretion. To say that the amount of notes should only be equal to what a metallic currency would have been, is a very intelligible proposition, and as we have observed, several banks have been constructed on that principle. But no banks constructed on this principle ever did, or by any possibility could do, banking business for profit. Every time that a bank discounts a bill it is a violation of the currency principle. The banks constructed on the currency principle were pure banks of deposit. They never did any discount business, they did nothing but exchange credit for specie and specie for credit, and if the Bank of England were forbidden to discount, there is no reason why it should not be reconstructed on this principle. But to suppose that the Bank Act really does carry out this principle is a most manifest error. In the first place it is evident that the £15 million of notes issued against the public debt and securities are a direct violation of the currency principle. How did the bank obtain these securities? By purchase. Now the purchase money of these securities is in circulation, and the notes created on their security as well. Is it not clear that these 15 millions of notes are an augmentation of currency to that amount? If it be true that these 15 millions of notes are not a violation of the currency principle, then the very same argument would show that the whole national debt might be coined into notes, and then there would be no more paper in circulation than under a purely metallic currency. Certainly it is an excellent plan for everyone to buy the funds with their cash, and then to be allowed to have it too in the form of notes. This was exactly John Law's principle, and if we may coin the funds into money we may just as well coin the land into money. But this does not show the full extent of the error of those who think that the Bank Act enforces the currency principle. The banking department does business like any other bank. It purchases or discounts bills of exchange by creating credit in its books, that it increases its liabilities in another form besides notes. This credit is equally in excess of the metallic currency. Therefore it is quite clear that those who seriously maintain that the Bank Act really carries out the currency principle must maintain this proposition. Twice 15 millions plus an indefinite number of millions equals 15 millions. In banks constructed on the currency principle, the credit created is always exactly equal in quantity to the money deposited and kept in the bank. But how does this matter stand in regard to the bank? To test this we need only take any one of its published returns at random. On the 27th of March 1873, it appears that the credit created by the bank amounted to £61,021,187, and the specie held by the bank amounted to £23,886,372, or about 2.6 to 1. If therefore it be maintained that the bank is constructed on the currency principle, it must also be maintained that 2, 6 are equal to 1. As a matter of pure arithmetic, therefore, it is perfectly clear that the Bank Act completely fails to carry out the principle it was intended to enforce. In fact, the framers of the Act had a theory, and they passed an Act, but they never took the slightest pains to ascertain whether the act corresponds with the theory. 9. The expressed purpose of the act was to cause a withdrawal of notes from circulation, that is from the public, exactly equal in quantity to the gold withdrawn from the bank in strict accordance with the currency principle, and it was supposed that if the directors neglected this duty, the tyrannical action of the act would compel them to fulfill it. It is now to be seen how this expectation was fulfilled. No occasion arose for testing the powers of the act till April 1847. The well-known disasters of 1846 caused a steady drain of bullion from the bank to commence in 1846. But the bank made no alteration in the rate of discount till 1847, when the bullion was below 14 millions. And the bank raised its discount to 37. Having lost another million in a fortnight, it raised discount to 4%. But it made no further alteration till it had lost 3 millions more, and then it raised its discount to 5%. Here we have the same inveterate error committed by the bankers on so many previous occasions, an immense drain of bullion, and none but the most feeble and inefficient means taken to stop it. But this pressure is an excellent example to test the alleged mechanical action of the act. We shall now first, how the bank was inclined to act on the principle. Second, supposing they were disinclined to do so, how far the act, by its self-acting principles, could compel them to do so. The following figures speak for themselves. These figures show the utter futility of the idea that, as the bullion diminished, the act could compel a reduction of notes in the hands of the public, for the notes in circulation were within an insignificant trifle as large in amount when the bullion was only £9,867,000, as when it was £16,366,000. Consequently, nothing could be a more total and complete failure of the Act of 1844. On the very first occasion its services were required. Lord Overstone complained to the Committee of 1840 that the principle laid down by the directors for managing the bank in 1832, provided no security that notes should be withdrawn from circulation as the gold was withdrawn from the bank, and it was the precise purpose of the Act of 1844 to compel the withdrawal of notes from the public exactly in the same degree as gold was withdrawn from the bank. And yet the foregoing figures show that the Bank Act failed on the very point it was expected to effect, and that it provided no effectual check whatever against mismanagement on the part of the bank. Whence did this failure arise? From this very simple circumstance. The framers of the Act supposed that there is only one way of extracting gold from the bank, namely, by means of its notes, and that if people want gold they must bring in notes, and consequently, that as the gold comes out, notes must go in. But as a matter of simple banking business, there are two methods of extracting gold from the bank, namely by notes and checks. Those persons who have credit in its books may go and present checks, and thus draw out every ounce of gold from the banking department, without a single banknote being withdrawn from the public. In fact, instead of withdrawing the notes from the public, as was intended by the Act, the directors threw the whole effect of the drain of gold on their own reserves. And that happened in this way. The public has two methods of extracting gold from the banking department, namely by notes and checks, but the banking department has only one method of extracting gold from the issue department, namely, its notes in reserve. And when the banking department felt a drain on its gold, it had to replenish it by obtaining a fresh supply from the issue department, at the same time giving up an exactly equal amount of notes. And thus the whole drain fell on its own reserves, without withdrawing a note from the public. No legislation can prevent this power of extracting gold from the bank by means of checks. And thus is explained the complete failure of the mechanical action of the Act to compel the directors to carry out the currency principle. The directors were able to commit, and actually did commit, the very same error as they had done before the Act, which Lord Overstone had truly said was the fundamental vice of the bank principle of 1832, and it was powerless to prevent them. And this simple fact completely upsets the whole theory of the Act. The fact is that there are two leaks to the ship. The framers of the Act could only perceive one, and they only provided against one, and they were utterly astonished to find the ship rapidly sinking from the other leak they had forgotten. 10. Now as the Act notoriously and manifestly failed in this most important point, which it was supposed to have rendered so secure, and which was fully and candidly admitted by Sir Robert Peel, it becomes a natural inquiry to ask why it failed. The reply to this is that the act failed because it aimed at the wrong mark altogether. It wholly missed the true point in the case. In former times it was a mercantile dogma that the exchanges could only be against the country in consequence of its being indebted to other countries. Nothing can be more striking than the vicious circle in which the commercial witnesses argued before the Bullion Committee of 1810. They maintained with unflinching perseverance that the exchanges could only be adverse because the country was indebted, and as the exchanges were adverse, they maintained that the country must be indebted, without the slightest inquiry into the fact, because the exchanges were adverse. However, the Bullion Committee completely disproved this commercial dogma, and they demonstrated beyond dispute that the depreciated paper currency was the cause of the exchanges being apparently adverse, but that when this depreciated paper currency was reduced to its true value in gold, the exchanges were in reality in favor of the country. The commercial witnesses maintained that when the indebtedness was paid off, the drain of bullion would cease of itself. But the Bullion Committee proved that with a paper currency so depreciated as banknotes then were, the drain would not cease until all the specie in circulation had left the country, which was amply verified in England at that period, and has been fully verified in many countries since. The Bullion Committee thus showed that there are two causes of a drain of bullion: first, the indebtedness of the country; second, a depreciated paper currency. But in our Theory and Practice of Banking, first published in 1856, we showed that there is a third cause of a drain of bullion, and an adverse exchange, which, however it might be known among commercial men, had never yet, that we have seen, found its way into any commercial book whatever, and most certainly had never been brought prominently before the public in currency discussions, as a cause of an adverse exchange, wholly irrespective of any indebtedness of the country, or of the state of the paper currency. The principle is this: that when the rate of discount between any two places differs by more than sufficient to pay the cost of transmitting bullion from one place to the other, bullion will flow from where discount is lower to where it is higher. We have fully explained this principle in the preceding chapter, so that we need not repeat the explanation here. Hence, if such a state of things arises, the bank must, as an indispensable measure to preserve its own security, raise its rate of discount so as to destroy these profits, and so arrest the drain, which is exclusively caused by the difference of the rates of discount in the two places. Now, when bullion dealers fabricate bills for the purpose of buying gold for exportation, this practice causes no increase of the banknotes in circulation. On the contrary, they are not wanted. It is gold that is demanded and taken for export, and it steals out of the country noiselessly and unobserved. Also, if bankers in this country will perversely maintain the rate of discount lower here than in neighboring countries, and, therefore, lower than the natural rate, persons in foreign countries send their debts or securities over here for sale, and the proceeds are remitted abroad. Consequently, this practice causes an export of gold without diminishing the notes in circulation. Of all species of property, debts are the most easily transportable. The charges on the transmission of gold even, are heavy compared to those on the transmission of debts. Debts to any amount can be transmitted from one country to another at the mere expense of the postage. Consequently, if the Americans can only get £85 per cent. for their debts in their own country, and they can get £96 per cent. in England, of course, they will send them here in vast quantities for realization. This was eminently and notoriously the case in 1839, when the Bank of England kept its rate so perversely below the natural rate, and it was the cause which aggravated the drain of bullion to so alarming an extent. Hence we have shown that besides the causes universally known for a drain of bullion, the indebtedness of the country and a depreciated paper currency, there is another and most potent cause whose importance has only been recently sufficiently recognized, namely, an unnatural depression of the rate of discount below that of neighboring countries. Now this principle was not understood at the time the Bank Act of 1844 was passed, and in our work on banking, 1856, we stated this as a fundamental principle of the currency. An improperly low rate of discount is in its practical effects a depreciation of the currency. We therefore showed that the only true method of striking at this demand for gold is by raising the rate of discount, and that the true supreme power of governing and controlling credit, or the paper currency, is by carefully adjusting the rate of discount by the state of the foreign exchanges, and the state of the bullion in the bank. The fact is that bullion dealers are the natural enemies of bankers, and they are constantly on the watch to take any advantage they can of the weakness of bankers. If they sell gold too cheaply, and they want this gold, not for the purpose of the internal commerce of the country, as other traders do, but for the express purpose of sending it to be sold in other countries where it has a higher value. They act exactly as people would do with corn dealers if they were so foolish as to sell their wheat at half the price it was selling at in neighboring markets. If the farmers were to keep selling their wheat at 408 a quarter in England, while the price was 80s in Paris, of course corp dealers would buy up the wheat in England and export it to France. Now the weak point in the Act of 1844 is that it takes no notice of this grand principle, it takes no precaution that the directors of the Bank of England shall recognise it, and counteract it. On the contrary, it leaves them in full power to repeat their oft-committed error of causing a depreciation of the currency from an unnaturally low rate of discount. And thus the fundamental vice of the Bank Act of 1844 is exactly the same as Lord Overstone said was the fundamental vice of the Bank Principle of 1832. The whole of the gold may be drawn out of the bank without withdrawing a single note from circulation, that is from the hands of the public. 11. This principle was extremely little understood in 1856, when our work was published, but its truth was soon signally verified and acknowledged to be true by the most competent authorities. After the great crisis of 1857, a committee of the House of Commons was appointed to investigate its causes, and Mr. Norman, a director of the Bank of England, and one of the most prominent and influential advocates of the currency principle and of the Bank Act of 1844 was asked. Q. 3529. Is it not principally by raising the rate of interest that you check the amount of discounts which may be demanded of you? Yes, we have found, contrary to what would have been anticipated, that the power we possess, and which we exercise, of raising the rate of discount, keeps the demand upon us within manageable dimensions. There are other restrictions which are less important. The rate we charge for our discounts, we find in general, is a sufficient check. In 1861 Mr. Goshen published his theory of the foreign exchanges. In it he says, the efficacy of that corrective of an unfavorable state of the exchanges, on which we have been dilating, that is raising the rate of discount, has been most thoroughly tested by late events. Every advance in the bank rate of discount has been followed by a turn of the exchanges in favor of England, and vice versa. As soon as the rate of interest was lowered, the exchanges became less favorable. It is quite needless to quote any more evidence in favor of this principle. Its truth is now as universally admitted by all competent persons as the Newtonian law of gravity. It is the acknowledged principle upon which the Bank of England is now managed. After our work was published in 1856, the usury laws in France were modified in order to enable the Bank of France to adopt it. And in fact it is now adopted by every bank in the world. In former times, when the only communication between different countries was by means of sailing ships and common roads, and therefore very slow, expensive, and uncertain, this principle, though actually true, could seldom be called into action, because the cost and delay in the transport of gold would far exceed any profit to be made out of the difference in the rates of discount. In quiet times, it was like some mechanical force, which actually exists, but which is overpowered and prevented from producing any visible effect, in consequence of friction. But it did act in times of commercial crisis, when the rate of discount became extreme. In 1799 enormous failures took place at Hamburg. Discount rose to 15%, and this rate immediately drew gold away from England. But in modern times, since communications have been so much accelerated and cheapened, even since the Act of 1844, by means of railroads and steamers, this friction, as we may call it, has been immensely diminished, and this great principle is called into action with a much less difference between the rates of discount than at any former period. Bullion would probably have taken 10 days to go from London to Paris. It can now go in 10 hours, and at probably the 10th part of the expense, a difference of 2%. between the rates of discount in London and Paris will now draw bullion from one place to the other. On the causes which compelled the suspension of the Bank Act in 1847, 1857, and 1866. 12. The monetary pressure which we mentioned above passed away at the time, but another much more severe came on in the autumn, which ended in a monetary panic, and on the 25th of November 1847, the government authorized the bank to exceed the limits allowed by the Act of 1844, if they considered it necessary to do so to restore commercial confidence. This suspension of the Act was perfectly successful, and on two similar occasions in 1857 and 1866 a similar course was followed with similar results. We have given a full narrative of the course of events preceding these panics in our Theory and Practice of Banking, to which we must refer those who desire full information on the subject. We must now only examine the reasons which made this course necessary, and why it was successful. Ever since the enormous development of the credit system of commerce in modern times, great commercial failures have periodically recurred, producing the most widespread distress, and there have been two conflicting theories as to what the action of the bank ought to be in a monetary crisis. 1. One theory maintains that in such a crisis, the bank should liberally expand its issues, to support commercial credit. This theory may be called the expansive theory. 2. The other theory maintains that in such a crisis the bank should rigorously restrict its issues to their usual amount, or even contract them. This theory may be called the restrictive theory. Both these theories have been tried in practice, and discussed by the most eminent authorities, and we may succinctly examine the results. The first great monetary crisis in modern times took place in 1763, after the termination of the 7 Years' War. This great disaster occurred at Hamburg and Amsterdam, where the currency principle was in full operation, and where there was no banking credit whatever, except what represented specie. The failures began at Amsterdam among the principal merchants. The bank had no power to assist them, and the resources of the private bankers were exhausted. Hearing that the Amsterdam bankers had determined to allow the merchants to fail, the Hamburg bankers wrote to them in the greatest alarm to say that if they did not support the merchants, they would instantly suspend their own payments. By the time the letter reached Amsterdam, the merchants had already stopped. General failure followed at Hamburg, where no business was transacted for some time, but for ready money. The failures were equally general throughout Germany. The crisis extended to England, and Smith says that the bank made advances to merchants to the amount of £1 million. Thus we see that the currency principle was no protection whatever against a monetary crisis, and on this occasion the bank acted on the expansive theory. In 1772 the severest monetary crisis since the South Sea Scheme took place. On this occasion again the bank came forward to support commercial credit. In 1782 our unhappy war with America was ended, and the usual results of the termination of a great contest took place. The bank had greatly extended its issues, and a very alarming drain of specie took place, which at one time threatened to oblige them to stop payment. The directors, however, considered that if they could only restrain their issues for a short period, the returns in specie in payment of the exports would soon set in a more rapid manner than they went out. They determined, therefore, to make no communication to government, but for the present to contract their issues until the exchanges turned in their favor. The bank felt the greatest alarm in May 1783. They then refused to make any advances to government on the loan of that year, but they did not make any demand for payment of their own advances, which were between 9 and 10 millions. They continued this policy up to October, when at length the drain had ceased from the country, and money had begun to flow in from abroad. At length in the autumn, when the favorable signs began to appear, they advanced freely to government on the loan, although at that time the cash in the bank was actually lower than at the time they felt the greatest alarm. It was then reduced to £473,000. The doctrine then stated by Mr. Bosanquet that guided the directors was this: that while a drain of specie was going on their issues should be contracted as much as possible, but that as soon as the tide had begun to give signs of ceasing, and turning the other way, it was then safe to extend their issues freely. This policy had been entirely successful, and the credit of the bank was saved. After the peace of 1782 the commercial energies of the country were greatly developed, To carry on this increased commerce, a greatly enlarged currency was necessary, and as the monopoly of the bank prevented solid banks being founded, innumerable tradesmen started up in every part of the country issuing notes. Burke says that when he came to England in 1750, there were not 12 bankers out of London. In 1792 there were about 400, the great majority being grocers, tailors, drapers, and petty shopkeepers. In the autumn of 1792 very numerous failures took place in Europe and America. In January 1793, the general alarm was greatly increased by the rapid progress of the French Revolution. Some great failures occurred in London in February, and soon the panic spread to the banks. Of these 100 stopped payment, and 200 were much shaken. The pressure in London intense, and this was naturally produced a demand on the bank for support and discounts. But the bank, being thoroughly alarmed, resolved to contract its issues. Bankruptcies multiplied with frightful rapidity. The government urged the bank to come forward to support credit, but they resolutely declined. In the meantime the most alarming news came from Scotland. The public banks were quite unable, with due regard to their own safety, to support the private bankers and commerce unless they received immediate assistance from government. General failure would ensue. When universal failure seemed imminent, Sir John Sinclair remembered the precedent of 1697, when the public distress was allayed by an issue of exchequer bills. A committee of the House of Commons was appointed, who reported that the sudden discredit of so large an amount of bankers' notes had produced a most inconvenient deficiency in the circulating medium, and that unless a circulating medium was provided, a general stoppage must take place. They recommended that exchequer bills to the amount of £5 million should be issued under the directions of a board of commissioners appointed for the purpose, in sums of £100, £50, and £20. No sooner was the act passed than the committee set to work. A large sum, £70,000, was at once set down to Manchester and Glasgow on the strength of the exchequer bills, which were not yet issued. This unexpected supply, coming so much earlier than was expected, operated like magic, and had a greater effect in restoring credit than 10 times the sum would have had at a later period. When the whole business was concluded, and report was presented to the Treasury, it stated that the knowledge that loans might be had, operated in many instances to prevent them being required. The applications granted were 238, and the sum advanced was £3,855,624. The whole sum advanced was repaid. 2 only of the parties assisted became bankrupt. All the others were ultimately solvent, and in many instances possessed of great property. A considerable part of the sum was repaid before it was due, and all the rest with the utmost punctuality. After all expenses were paid, the transaction left a clear profit to the government of £4,348. Contemporary writers all bear witness to the extraordinary effects produced. Macpherson says that the very intimation of the intention of the legislature to support the merchants operated like a charm over the whole country, and in a great degree superseded the necessity of relief by an almost instantaneous restoration of confidence. Sir Francis Baring concurs in this view, and adduces the remarkable success of the measure as an argument to show the mistaken policy of the bank. After careful deliberation, the Bullion Report warmly approved of it, censured the proceedings of the bank, and especially cited it as an illustration of the principle they laid down, that an enlarged accommodation is the true remedy for that occasional failure of confidence to which our system of paper credit is unavoidably exposed. This occasion, therefore, is a most important example of the beneficial effects of the expansive theory in a monetary panic. Towards the end of 1794 the exchanges began to fall rapidly, and in May, 1795, were so low that it was profitable to export bullion. While, however, the exchanges were so adverse the issues of the bank were immensely extended. After some time however the directors became alarmed and took the most rigorous measures to contract them. In April 1796 the exchanges became favourable, and they continued so till February 1797. The excessive contraction of its issues by the bank caused the greatest inconvenience to commerce, and a meeting of bankers and merchants was held to devise some means of relief. The failures among the country bankers in 1793 had caused an immense diminution of the country issues, and Thornton says that in the last 3 months of 1796 the issues of the bank were no higher than they had been in 1782, with an amount of commerce many times larger than in that year. As the public could not get notes, they made a steady and continuous demand for guineas, and although the exchanges were favourable to the country and gold was coming in from abroad, there was a severe drain on the bank for gold. Political circumstances added to the alarm, and about the middle of February a stoppage of country banks became general. The panic reached London, and a general run began upon the bankers. Before this the directors had used the most violent efforts to contract their issues. In 5 weeks they had reduced them by nearly £2 million. On the 21st January they were £10,550,830, and on the 21st February they were £8,640,250. But even this gave no true idea of the curtailment of mercantile accommodation, for the private bankers were obliged for their own security to follow the example of the bank. In order to meet their payments, persons were obliged to sell their stock of all descriptions at an enormous sacrifice. The 3% fell to 51. On Saturday the 25th of February 1797, the specie in the bank par reduced to £1,272,000, with the drain becoming severer every hour. The directors now felt that they could hold out on longer, and on Sunday a cabinet council was held, and an order in council was issued directing the bank to suspend payments in cash until the sense of Parliament could be taken on the subject. Accordingly on Monday the 27th, the cash being then reduced to £1,086,170, the bank suspended payments in cash, and did not resume them partially till 1816, and completely till 1821. But immediately this was done, they enlarged their accommodation liberally. Within a week they increased their issues by 2 millions, and the relief was very great. A meeting of 4,000 merchants and traders agreed to support the credit of the notes. The most eminent authorities afterwards severely censured the management of the bank. Thornton said that the excessive contraction of notes had shaken public credit of all descriptions, and had caused an unusually severe demand for guineas, that the bank ought to have extended its issues to supply the places of the country notes which were discredited. Boyd was clearly of opinion that the excessive restriction of notes was the chief cause of the forced sale and depreciation of the public securities. In 1810 the governor of the bank said that after the experience of the policy of restriction, many of the directors repented of the measure, and the Bullion Committee explicitly condemned the policy of the bank both in 1793 and 1797. Nothing in short could be more unhappy than their regulation of their issues. When the exchanges were violently adverse, so that it was very profitable to export gold, they enlarged them to an extravagant extent, and when the exchanges were extremely favourable, so that gold was flowing in, they contracted them with merciless severity. The issues which were £14 million when the exchanges were against the country were reduced to £8,640,250 when they had been for several months eminently favourable. The entire concurrence of the evidence shows that it was this excessive restriction of credit which caused the severe demand for gold. And now we see the practical results of the two policies. When all commercial and banking credit was on the verge of universal ruin, it was saved and restored by the expansive theory in 1793. In 1797 the restrictive theory was carried out to the bitter end, and the result was the stoppage of the bank. A consideration of all these circumstances induced the Bullion Committee to condemn the restrictive theory in the most emphatic terms, and all the greatest mercantile authorities of the period, including Peel himself in 1819, entirely concurred in these doctrines, and he said that no limitation of the bank's power of issue could ever be prescribed at any period however remote. That period however came in 1844. The next great crisis was in 1825. Ever since the beginning of 1824 there had been a continual drain of bullion which the bank took no means to stop. It fell from 134 millions in March 1824, steadily and continuously to barely 3 millions in November 1825, when everyone felt a crisis to be impending. The papers discussed the policy of the bank, and it was generally expected that it would rigorously contract its issues. The panic began on Monday the 12th of December 1825, with the fall of Pole, Thornton and Co., one of the principal city banks, which drew down with them 40 country banks. A general run began upon all the city bankers. For 3 days the bank pursued a policy of the most severe restriction. Mr. Huskisson said that during 48 hours it was impossible to convert into money, to any extent, the best securities of the government. Exchequer bills, bank stock, East India stock, as well as the public funds, were unsaleable. At last, when universal stoppage was imminent, the bank completely reversed its policy. On Wednesday, the 14th, it discounted with the utmost profuseness. Mr. Harmon said, "We lent by every possible means, and in modes we had never adopted before. We took in stock as security, we purchased exchequer bills, we made advances in exchequer bills, we not only discounted outright, but we made advances on depositive bills of exchange to an immense amount, in short by every possible means consistent with the safety of the bank, and we were not, on some occasions, over-nice. Seeing the dreadful state the public were in, we rendered every assistance in our power." Between Wednesday and Saturday the bank issued £5,000,000 in notes, and sent down to the country a large box of £1 notes, which they accidentally found. This bold policy was crowned with the most complete success. The panic was stayed almost immediately, and by Saturday was over. The circumstances of this crisis are the most complete and triumphant example of the truth of the principles of the Bullion Report, and of the expansive theory, and signally vindicate the wisdom of Peel in 1819, when he refused to adopt the restrictive theory, and impose a numerical limit on their bank's issues, and which he again protested against in 1833. The next crisis was in 1837, but the bank, foreseeing it, judiciously anticipated it, and made the most liberal issues to houses which required it. By thus adopting the expansive theory in good time, nothing more occurred than a severe monetary pressure, which was prevented from deepening into a crisis entirely by the judicious conduct of the bank. Up to this period Sir Robert Peel had passed through 2 phases of opinion with regard to the currency question. When comparatively a young man he had formed one of that famous majority which had voted that a £1 note and 18 were exactly equal to a £1 note and 78, or that 21 is equal to 27. In 1819 he completely adopted the doctrines of the Bullion Report and became a disciple of the school of Horner, Huskisson, Thornton, and Ricardo. But in 1840 a new school of currency theorists had arisen, of whom the most distinguished were Mr. Jones Lloyd, now Lord Overstone, Colonel Trans, Mr. Norman and others. These influential persons saw that notwithstanding the undoubted truth of the doctrines of the Bullion Report, there was some incurable vice in the management of the Bank of England, which had, beyond all dispute, greatly conduced to prepare the way for the great commercial crisis of 1825 by its extravagant issues of notes. They found that the bank was totally unable to manage itself on the principles it professed to be guided by. They traced the original source of all commercial crises to the excessive issues of notes by banks. They adopted the definition of currency as being money and bank notes only payable to bearer on demand, to the exclusion of all other forms of paper credit, and they maintained that the only true principle of issuing notes was that when notes were issued they should be exactly equal in amount to what the specie would be if there were no notes. These doctrines being strenuously urged by a number of able and influential persons, completely converted Sir Robert Peel, who now entered on the 3rd phase of opinion with respect to the currency question, and by the Bank Act of 1844 he endeavoured to give effect to these doctrines. Peel therefore determined now to adopt the restrictive theory, and to impose by law, what every eminent authority of former times including himself had solemnly condemned, a numerical limit on the issues of the bank. The Bank Act was passed amid general applause, but as said above, on the very first occasion on which its powers were tested in April 1847, it completely failed to compel the directors to carry out its principles, and 1/3 of its bullion ebbed away, without any appreciable diminution of the amount of its notes in circulation. But in October 1847 a far severer crisis took place. The bank made immense advances to other banks and houses to prevent them from stopping payment. But numerous banks and commercial houses did stop payment, and the resources of the bank were exhausted. At last, after repeated deputations to the government to obtain a relaxation of the act, and with the stoppage of the whole commercial world imminent, the government authorized the bank to issue notes at discretion. And what was the result? The panic vanished in 10 minutes. No sooner was it known that notes might be had if necessary, than the want of them ceased. The whole issue of notes in consequence of this letter was only £400,000, and the legal limits of the Act were not exceeded. Thus on this occasion again, the restrictive theory wholly failed, and the expansive theory saved the country and was the only means of saving the bank itself from stopping payment. The next great crisis was in November 1857, which was far more severe, as regards the bank itself, than that of 1847. On the 12th of November 1857 the bank closed its doors with the sum of £68,085 in notes, £274,953 in gold, and £41,106 in silver, being a total sum of £387,144. Such were the resources of the bank to begin business with on the 13th. Truly, said the governor, it must entirely have ceased discounting, which would have brought an immediate run upon it. The banker's balances alone were £5,458,000. It is easy to see that the bank could not have kept its doors open for an hour. On the evening of the 12th the government sent a letter to the bank, authorizing them to issue notes at their discretion, but not at a less rate than 10%, and next morning as before, the panic had passed away. Thus on this occasion again, the restrictive theory wholly failed, and the expansive theory saved the country, and was the only means of saving the bank itself from stopping payment. The next great crisis was in 1866, which was still more unfortunately, no investigation was held respecting it, so that there is no reliable account of its circumstances. On the 10th of May there was a general run upon all the London banks. It was said, but we cannot say with what truth, that one great bank alone paid away £2 million in 6 hours. After banking hours it became known that the great discount house of Overend, Gurney and Company had stopped with liabilities exceeding 10 millions, the most stupendous failure that had ever taken place in the city. The result of such a catastrophe was easily foreseen. Not another bank could have survived the next day, and that evening the government again authorized the bank to issue at discretion, at not less than 10%. The bank advanced £12,255,000 in 5 days, but the panic passed away. Thus again the restrictive theory wholly failed. The expansive theory saved the country, and was the only means of saving the bank itself as well as every other bank from stopping payment. Thus we see the entire failure of Peel's expectations. He took away the power of unlimited issues from the bank, and imposed a rigorous numerical limit on its powers of issue, under the hope that he had prevented the recurrence of panics. But the panics recurred with precisely the same regularity as before, and therefore in this sense too the Act has failed. And when monetary crises do occur, it is decisively proved that it is wholly incompetent to deal with them. It has been seen that it is a complete delusion to suppose that the Bank Act carries out the currency principle. It might be supposed perhaps, that if it did really carry out the currency principle it might prevent panics arising. General experience however entirely negatives this view. In 1764 the most severe monetary crisis which had occurred up to that time, took place at Amsterdam and Hamburg, where the banks were really constructed on the currency principle. A decisive example of this took place at Hamburg in 1857. A similar monetary crisis took place there as here, and the bank being constructed on the currency principle had no power to issue notes to support credit. The magistrates were obliged to issue city bonds to support the credit of the merchants, exactly as the government had issued exchequer bills in England in 1793. Here also the restrictive theory wholly failed, and it was found necessary to adopt the expansive theory to avert universal failure. This disaster took place where the currency principle was in full force, another instance that it is no protection against panics. The experience of every country exactly confirms the experience of England. At Turin the bank was constructed on some principle of limitation, but in 1857 it was found necessary to suspend its constitution, and allow it to issue notes to support credit. The very same thing was conspicuously proved in 1873. In Austria, in North Germany, and in America, the banks were all constructed on some analogous principle of limitation of their issues. But in the severe monetary panic in each of these countries, it was found necessary to suspend their constitutions, and authorize them to issue at discretion to support commercial credit. Thus universally throughout the world, it is proved by abundant experience, that the restrictive theory cannot be maintained after a monetary panic has reached a certain degree of intensity, and that it is absolutely necessary to adopt the expansive theory to avert universal failure. 13. The supporters of the Act of 1844 assert that it is the complement of, and in strict accordance with the principles of the Act of 1819, and the Bullion Report. But such statements are utterly incorrect, and the following are the fundamental differences of principle between them. I. The Bullion Report declares that the mere numerical amount of notes in circulation, at any time, is no criterion whether they are excessive or not. The theory of the framers of the Act is that the notes in circulation should be exactly equal in quantity to what the gold coin would be if there were no notes, and that any excess of notes above that quantity is a depreciation of the currency. Is this principle of the supporters of the Act in accordance with the principle of the Bullion Report? 2. The Bullion Report declares, and the supporters of the Act of 1819 maintained, that the sole test of the depreciation of the paper currency is to be found in the price of gold bullion and the state of the foreign exchanges. Ricardo says, the issuers of paper money should regulate their issues solely by the price of bullion, and never by the quantity of their paper in circulation. The quantity can never be too great or too little, while it preserves the same value as the standard. According to the supporters of the Act of 1844, the true criterion is whether the notes do or do not exceed in quantity the gold they displace. Is the doctrine of the supporters of the Act of 1844 in accordance with the doctrine of the Bullion Report and the framers of the Act of 1819? 3. It was proposed to the Bullion Committee to impose a positive limit on the issues of the bank to curb their powers of mismanagement. The Bullion Report expressly condemns any positive limitation of its issues, and Peel in 1819 and in 1833, fully concurred in this condemnation. The Bank Act of 1844 expressly limits the issues of the bank. Does the Bank Act of 1844 coincide with the principles of the Bullion Report and the doctrines of Peel in 1819 and 1833? 4. The Bullion Report, after discussing the most important monetary crises which had occurred up to that time, expressly condemns the restrictive theory in a monetary panic, and says that it may lead to universal ruin, and recommends the expansive theory. The Bank Act enacts the restrictive theory by law, and prevents the expansive theory from being adopted. Does the Bank Act of 1844 agree with the doctrines of the Bullion Report, and of Peel in 1819 and 1833? On this point, Peel in introducing his measure of 1844 said we must never again have such discreditable occasions as 1825, 1836, and 1839. But since 1844 we have had 1847, 1857, and 1866. On each of these occasions the restrictive theory was enacted by law, and on each occasion the government was obliged to come forward and authorize the bank to break the law, to abandon the restrictive theory, and adopt the expansive theory, as the only method of averting ruin. Experience, therefore, has indisputably proved that the Bullion Report was framed with truer wisdom and scientific knowledge of the principles of paper currency than the Bank Act of 1844. The only deficiency in the report was that it failed to point out the proper means for carrying its principles into effect so as to maintain paper on a par with gold. But we supplied this defect by showing that the true means of controlling the paper currency is by adjusting the rate of discount by the foreign exchanges and the state of the bullion in the bank. Examination of the arguments alleged for maintaining the Bank Act. 14. It has now been clearly shown that the Bank Act has completely failed both in theory and practice. It has been shown that it is based on a definition of the word 66 currency which any mercantile lawyer would at once pronounce to be erroneous. That it professes to adopt a theory of currency which it has entirely failed to enforce. that if the directors choose they can mismanage the bank quite as easily under the Act as before it, and that the pretended mechanical action of the Act wholly failed to prevent them from doing so, that the Act was expressly framed with the expectation that it would prevent commercial panics, and that it has wholly failed in doing so, and hitherto panics have recurred with the same regularity as before, and furthermore, although the Act is in no sense whatever the cause or original source of these crises, yet when they do occur, and they reach a certain degree of intensity, the operation of the Act, by visibly limiting the means of assistance, deepens a severe monetary pressure into a panic, which can only be allayed by its suspension, and a violation of its principles. In every one of these respects the Bank Act has completely failed, and in regard to these things its credit and reputation is utterly dead and gone. It is therefore necessary to examine fairly the arguments alleged in its favor, and the reasons urged why it should still be maintained. The supporters of the Act, allowing that it has failed in some respects, yet allege that the directors having committed the same mischievous errors as they had done before it arrested their mismanagement much sooner than would otherwise have been the case, and that when the panic did occur, it was only through the Act that the bank had 6 millions of gold to meet the crisis, and that by this means the convertibility of the note was secured. So far as regards the crisis of 1847, it must be admitted that there is much truth and force in this argument. The directors at that date showed that they had not yet acquired the true principles of banking, and it must be conceded that it was entirely owing to the Act that they were checked in their unmistaken policy while there was still 6 millions of gold in the bank. But the same ground of censure did not apply to the crisis of 1857. In the interval between 1847 and 1857, the directors really grasped the true method of controlling the paper currency by means of the rate of discount. The truth of this principle was probably more quickly enforced on their attention by the limitation imposed by the Act than it would otherwise have been. It has never been alleged that the commercial crisis of 1857 was in any way due to the Act, but it is a matter of positive certainty that since that date the bank has fully recognized and adopted the principle of governing the paper currency by means of the rate of discount. The same rule has been adopted by the Bank of France, and this is now the recognized principle by which every bank is managed. Certainly since 1857 there has been nothing to blame in the general management of the bank. Granting every merit that can fairly be due to the Act, that it has compelled the recognition and adoption of this principle some years earlier than it otherwise would have been, it may be said that the Act has now fulfilled its purpose. It has done all the good it can do. The directors now perfectly understand, and have for the last 19 years conducted the bank with the greatest success on sound principles. Having therefore accomplished this great purpose, the Act has done its work, and has ceased to be necessary, and its operation at other most important times being proved to be injurious by the most overwhelming evidence, it may now be safely and advantageously repealed, so far at least as regards the limitation of its power of issue. And the reason for the expediency of this change is this: under the present system of commercial credit, there must be some source with the power of issuing undoubted credit to support solvent commercial houses in times of monetary panic. It has been conclusively shown in the preceding remarks, that it is entirely futile to expect that commercial crises can be prevented, and that they occur with precisely the same violence in places where there is a purely metallic currency as anywhere else. Hence, the illusions in this respect, on which the Act was founded, are now completely vanished. In all cases, houses which are clearly insolvent should not be supported, they ought to be compelled to stop without any hesitation. To support such houses is a fraud upon their creditors. But under our complicated system of commerce, the credit of even the most solvent houses is so intertwined and connected with others, that no one can tell how far any house, even of the highest name, is solvent. Consequently everyone is affected by this universal discredit. Many houses which are really solvent, may have their assets locked up in some form which is not readily convertible. Under such circumstances it is absolutely indispensable, to prevent universal ruin, that there should be some source with the power of issuing undoubted credit to houses which can prove their solvency. And there are but two sources from which such credit can be issued: the Government and the Bank of England. In 1793 the Bank resolutely refused to support commercial credit, and the Government was obliged to assist solvent houses with exchequer bills, and this saved the commercial community from ruin. In 1797 the bank also refused to support commerce, and the result was its own stoppage. After the stoppage, however, it largely extended its issues, and commerce was relieved. In every commercial crisis since 1797, however sternly the bank has adopted the restrictive theory at first, it has ultimately been driven to abandon it, and adopt the expansive theory. In 1825, while the bank persisted in the restrictive theory, some eminent bankers stopped payment with assets worth 40s in the pound. 2 days afterwards the bank changed its policy, and issued notes with the most profuse liberality, and the panic vanished. If the bank had adopted this principle at first, and assisted those bankers who were really solvent, they would have been saved from stopping payment. The very same principle was decisively proved in 1847, 1857, and 1866. The restrictive theory was in those years enforced by law. But no government could maintain the Act and the restrictive theory to the bitter end, and face the consequences of producing universal ruin in pursuance of a theory which all the most distinguished authorities had unanimously condemned. It is therefore irrefragably proved by the unanimous opinion of the most eminent commercial authorities, and the clear experience of 100 years, that the restrictive theory in a commercial crisis is a fatal delusion, and that when a commercial panic is impending, the only way to avert and allay it is to give prompt, immediate, and liberal assistance to all houses who can prove themselves to be solvent, at the same time allowing all houses which are really insolvent to go. Universal experience proves that this is the only means of separating the sound from the unsound, and averting general ruin by preserving the former. As a matter of fact, it is perfectly well known to all bankers that an excessive restriction of credit produces and causes a run for gold. Sir William Forbes, in his interesting Memoirs of a Banking House, says of the crisis of 1793, these proceedings, which obviously foreboded a risk of hostilities, were the signal for a check on mercantile credit all over the kingdom, and that check led by consequence to a demand on bankers for the money deposited with them, in order to supply the wants of mercantile men. The Bullion Report expressly attributes the stoppage of the bank in 1797 to the merciless restriction of credit. In 1857 discounts had ceased at the various banks and a general run was commencing upon them when the Treasury letter came. This allayed the panic and stopped the run. In 1866 matters were a great deal worse. In consequence of the restriction on credit, a most severe and general run took place on all the London bankers. The sum paid away during the panic can probably never be known, but it was something perfectly fabulous, and this general run upon the bankers was certainly caused and produced by the excessive restriction of credit, caused by the Bank Act. The result of such an act was most distinctly predicted by Henry Thornton, one of the joint authors of the Bullion Report, in his treatise on the paper credit of Great Britain published in 1802. He says, "Two kinds of error on the subject of the affairs of the Bank of England have been prevalent. Some political persons have assumed it to be a principle, that in proportion as the gold of the bank lessens, its paper, or, as is sometimes said, its loans, for the amount of the one has been confounded with that of the other, ought to be reduced. It has been already shown, that a maxim of this sort, if strictly followed up, would lead to universal failure. The Bank Act of 1844 was constructed on this precise principle, and Thornton's prediction has been strictly verified. Seeing then that it is a matter of absolute demonstration that it is indispensably necessary that there must be some source having the power to issue solid credit to support solvent houses in monetary panics, it only remains to consider whether that source should be the government, or the bank, and very convincing reasons show that it ought to be the bank rather than the government. Such a duty is quite out of the usual line of the government. They must issue a special commission to investigate the solvency of those merchants who ask for assistance. Such a commission would never be appointed until matters had become very severe, and much suffering would be caused by the unnecessary delay. But such a thing is the ordinary and everyday business of the bank. The merchant simply goes in the ordinary way of business to the directors, satisfies them of his solvency, gives them the necessary security, and receives the assistance without delay. These considerations, as well as others which might be adduced, show that the proper source to have this power is the Bank of England, and not the government. Some persons however might suppose that such an issue of notes might turn the foreign exchanges against the country. It was formerly supposed, and the idea pervaded Sir Robert Peel's speech, that the foreign exchanges are mainly influenced by the numerical amount of notes issued. But in modern times it has been proved that the rate of discount is an infinitely more powerful method of acting on the exchanges than the amount of notes. And this may be said to be a new discovery since Sir Robert Peel's speech, for there is not a trace of this principle to be found in it. Nor did any of the practical men of business who supported the Act ever show that they appreciated the importance of this principle. In former times certainly, when there were multitudes of banks issuing torrents of notes, these notes lowered the rate of discount, and drove the bullion out of the country. But under the modern system, when these issues have been happily suppressed, all danger on this score has vanished. And under present circumstances no issues are excessive which do not lower the rate of discount. The doctrine laid down in the Bullion Report and by all the most eminent authorities of that period, was, that the true criterion of the proper quantity of paper currency was not its numerical amount, but the state of the foreign exchanges and the market price of gold bullion. This doctrine was true so far as it went, but unfortunately it was incomplete. The committee never laid down the rule for carrying this principle into effect. The principal method thought of until after Peel's time was simply diminishing the numerical amount of the notes. It is true that raising the rate of discount was reckoned among the subsidiary methods of arresting a drain, but so little was its true importance understood that it was not even mentioned by Peel. But in our theory and practice of banking we showed by the plainest arguments that it is the true keystone of the theory of the Bullion Report, and it is now proved by conclusive experience that it is the true supreme power of controlling the exchanges and the paper currency, and all other methods are insignificant compared to it. And since the directors now thoroughly understand and act upon this principle, they may be entrusted with unlimited powers of issue. Some able authorities however are of opinion that the Act should be maintained, as it strengthens the hands of the directors in carrying out this principle, and enforcing the rule. That without the Act commercial pressure upon them might sometimes be too strong to resist. Whatever force there may be in this argument, it will be found that the other arguments completely outweigh it, and in fact such an argument naturally leads us to consider the constitution of the directorate itself. By a remarkable custom professional bankers are excluded from the directorate of the bank, which is exclusively composed of merchants. It has long been recognized that commercial credit and banking credit are of two distinct natures and in many respects conflicting and antagonistic. The same persons should not carry on both kinds of business. Great bankers should not be merchants, and great merchants should not be bankers. The duty of a banker frequently conflicts with, and is antagonistic to, the interest of a merchant. A banker's duty is to keep himself always in a position to meet his liabilities on demand, and when there is a pressure upon him it is his duty to raise the price of his money. But the interest of a merchant always is to get accommodation as cheap as possible. Hence, as the directors emanate exclusively from the commercial body, the interest of the body from which they come, has been frequently opposed to their duty as directors of the bank. And formerly it cannot be denied, that their sympathy for the body to which they belonged has interfered with their proper course of action as directors of the bank, and has been the cause of many errors. The whole principles of the subject have now been brought to strictly scientific demonstration. If therefore the directors find themselves unable to withstand commercial pressure, and fulfill their undoubted duty, it would seem to raise the question whether some modification of the constitution of the directorate might not be desirable, and whether a certain portion of them at least, should not be unconnected with commerce, as private bankers are. There are very good reasons why they should not be exclusively taken from the commercial body. The overwhelming weight of practical considerations is in favor of restoring the bank to its original condition, and abolishing the separation of the departments, which, as has been shown, was intended to carry out a particular theory, but which it wholly fails to do. For while times are quiet, or even during a moderately severe monetary pressure, the Act is wholly in abeyance, it is entirely inoperative. But when a real commercial crisis takes place, and it totally fails to prevent these as it was expected to do. And when the crisis has deepened beyond a certain degree of intensity, then the act springs into action with deadly effect. It prevents by law the only course being adopted which the unvarying experience of 100 years has shown to be indispensable to avert a panic, namely, a timely and liberal assistance to solvent houses. Then follows wild panic, and if the act were rigorously maintained, then universal ruin. The true object of the act is to ensure the convertibility of the banknote. But the principle of the act, or the machinery devised for that purpose, is merely means to that end, and it has been proved to be defective. A better means of attaining the object of the act has been ascertained and demonstrated to be true by the strictest scientific reasoning, as well as by abundant experience, since the passing of the act, which is acknowledged to be efficacious, and, therefore, the act is no longer necessary. The necessity for passing the act was a deep discredit to the directors of the bank. It was a declaration that they were not competent to manage their own business. But now that they have shown that they are perfectly able to do so, it is no longer necessary. It may be sometimes necessary to put a patient into a strait waistcoat, but when the patient is perfectly recovered and is restored to his right mind, the strait waistcoat may be removed, especially as it is found that under certain circumstances the strait waistcoat not only strangles the patient, but scatters death and destruction all around.